Hey everyone, welcome to this panel. Thank you for spending your Sunday evening with us. This panel is about gatekeeping in the food industry, and I'm really thrilled to be joined by three trailblazers in the industry. My name's Priya Krishna. I'm the author of the cookbook Indianish, and I am joined today by Dr. Jessica B. Harris, who's the author, editor, or translator of 18 books, including 12 cookbooks documenting the foods and foodways of the African diaspora. We have John Birdsall, a two-time James Beard Award-winning author and former restaurant critic, who just wrote a book that came out called The Man Who Ate Too Much, The Life of James Beard. Also, Dr. Jessica B. Harris just wrote an amazing book that I just reread called My Soul Looks Back. And then we've got Victoria James, who's a sommelier and a beverage director at Cote Korean Steakhouse, where she received James Beard nomination for Outstanding Wine Program. She's the author of Drink Pink, A Celebration of Rosé, and Wine Girl, The Obstacles, Humiliations, and Triumphs of America's Youngest Sommelier. So I'd love to get right into it. This is a topic about gatekeeping. So the first question I want to ask is, what does it mean to be a gatekeeper, and who are the gatekeepers in our industry? Like, how would you define what that looks like in our industry?
Anyone? Jump in. I was surprised when it was called Gatekeepers, because I don't think of myself as a gatekeeper at all. I mean, I think that certainly in our industry, and remember that I am a cookbook author, I am not necessarily a sommelier or anything, or a chef. But what happened was, for many years, I would have thought somebody like Judith Jones was a gatekeeper. I think many of the culinary editors, certainly back in the day, were gatekeepers. I am not sure who they might be today, if anyone. Certainly some of the major magazine editors I would consider gatekeepers. It all depends, I guess, on how you define the gate. I've never really had a gate, so I don't think of myself as a gatekeeper. I'm somebody who's trying to hop over the gate.
Go ahead.
I can say in the wine world, historically, it's always been the old boys club, or sort of, the pale male and stale community that have been these historic gatekeepers, because the people that hold these positions of powers, from sommeliers to beverage directors and such, are traditionally older white men. And it's changing now. You're starting to see more wine directors in Michelin-starred restaurants that are persons of color or women, but it's still very much in the minority, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think, in terms of gatekeepers, they're sort of the obvious suspects in food media, in media generally. I mean, you have to look at also sort of voting panels for the James Beard Awards. Mm-hmm. Definite gatekeepers in our industry. They can make careers and they can hold careers back. But I think the gate in food media is just a kind of overarching, I think, reductive sense of what food media is, what food is. I'm just amazed that after so many years, the same kind of cliches keep getting greenlighted in our industry, thinking of food as like celebration, or, something that brings a community together. And there's so many more interesting, complicated stories that kind of mainstream food media doesn't allow to be told.
Or like doesn't even allow to be told in nuanced ways. Like it has to be told in a specific way.
Right, exactly. I mean, you get representation for a group that you're perceived to be a voice for, but it's very kind of flattened out, very kind of cliche often. Yeah.
So I'm really curious, jumping off of that point, you all have sort of found success in this industry. Whoever those gatekeepers are have deemed all of you successful, acceptable, people, despite all of you coming from marginalized communities within this industry. So like, what do you sort of make of that, like finding success in an industry that has historically not really valued people who don't fit the mold, while also like establishing your success through existing within the margins, if that makes sense? Like, what do you make of that?
I guess I'll go first. You know, I think it's interesting in the wine world, the Court of Master Sommeliers has always sort of been this big gatekeeper here in the United States since around the 80s. That's changing, but it's a community I've never really belonged to, or they rather have thought I, didn't really belong. And so as a result, I sort of forged my own way outside of, the Master Sommelier accreditation for various reasons I talk about in my book that deal with abuse and harassment and just this toxic culture, this sort of fraternity culture. And, eventually I realized what set me apart from my peers, the fact that I was this young woman in a boys' club, was actually also a strength. So although some people perceived it as a weakness, it's what made me unique. And actually it's what eventually brought me success and what made me an individual in my own right. So I think it can sometimes be a double-edged sword.
I mean, honestly, what I struggle with is the fact that a big part of my success was being a part of a YouTube channel that like tokenized me and flattened my identity and like put me in a box. And I often like don't know what to do with that. Like I have a large following because of that channel, because of this like mainstream publication that like deemed me acceptable to its viewers. But like what version of me did it present to its viewers? Like what flattened version of my identity were they presented? I continue to have a hard time with that.
Right. Yeah, and it's I mean, in some ways, success in a kind of culture of gatekeepers is, you definitely sort of make a devil's bargain. I got kind of known by editors because of something that I wrote, so I kind of became like the queer food writer, and so it's really hard to shake that one kind of identity. What food media sees as your value, as your skill set. And breaking out of that can be hard. And so, it's like, predictably every June, Pride Month, I'll get some assignments or I'll be interviewed, which is great. I mean, it's, the sort of queer food community is something that I feel honored to be a part of and have been able to give, voice to in some way. But it also does feel really kind of reductive. As you said, Priya, it's like a flattening out of who you are. And it doesn't necessarily lead to the most interesting stories being told.
I mean, Dr. Harris, when you were kind of coming up in the food world, did you feel that way, that like your identity was flattened? Like, how did you you've told so many like rich, diverse, complex stories about African foodways, but did you ever feel the way like that we just described?
I think that there are several things here. First of all, found success, but I'll get to that later because I'm not sure that I have. But equally, my choice has always been to write about the food of the African diaspora. Now, some of that was choice by choice, and some of that was choice by default, because it was the only thing I was allowed to write about. I happen to speak fluent French, fairly fluent Portuguese, and fairly fluent Spanish. So, I mean, I think that there is that. I think there's so many African-American writers who would say to John, hey, they call you in Pride Month. Well, guess what February is? Right. I think that there are all sorts of things that have been fairly toxic for a fairly long time. People talk about success. I don't know what success really means. Are we talking financial success? Are we talking commercial success? Are we talking what? Because they're very, very different things. People talk about book deals. How much did you make for your book? Well, first of all, I think most authors lie. Unless they're very, very good friends, they tell you something else. I made $4,000 for my first cookbook. I wrote it back in 1985. My foray into the wonderful world of cookbook writing has not netted me money. I've had a full-time job all along, and that's 50 years worth of teaching at Queens College. And you want to talk six-figure book deals, which people bandy around like everything nowadays. I got my first one last year. So what does success mean? Okay. And I don't think people are aware of that. And I don't think people think about that. The other question is about being balkanized into a particular area, one way or the other. Your book is called Indianish, right?
Yep.
Okay. So what happens if you want to write about the food of Spain or that wine you were just showing that you drank, which is Portuguese? You are Miss Indianish. How do you get out of that? Where do you go from that? What do you do? Or do you get out of it? I mean, obviously my choice was not to get out of it, but that is a choice, but it is also a boxing in. There are an awful lot of things that are, very much a part of this. What is success? What do you mean? Gatekeeper. Yeah, I was perhaps a gatekeeper more when I did restaurant reviews for the Village Voice, which everybody has forgotten or didn't even know or didn't know it was a person of color. So I was a gatekeeper, but I was also a gate opener. I used to always feel that, hey, they're going to serve one Black lady, right? Thinking it was me. So that there's so many different things that go with this. And I think we need to pay attention to all of those things and all of those permutations and, differences.
You mentioned something that I've been thinking about, the idea of like gatekeeping. I feel like is always perceived as like preventing people from entering, but I feel like gates can swing both ways. You can open the gate in addition to sort of closing the gate. Like, I know, Dr. Harris, you said you don't feel that you are a gatekeeper, but do you all sort of feel a responsibility to like bring other members of your community up with you and like open the door wider, and sort of like, how does that manifest itself for you?
Well, I think in any number of ways. Earlier, before we were online, you mentioned Nicole Taylor in an article that she wrote. Nicole told me about a week before she was going to be giving the party at my house that she was giving the party and doing the article. I mean, I've mentored, for want of a better word, and it's probably a word I prefer to opening gates, but people write me through my website. I don't have an assistant. I answer. So when they get an answer, it's from me. I don't have people for any number of reasons. I would probably like to have a few people write about now, but I don't. So, if you write me, you get me. And I try to help you. I just yesterday sort of connected a young student from, I don't know, Hunter College with a former Haitian colleague of mine because he wanted to do research into Haitian food. I mean, that's what your job is. I spent 50 years, as I said, teaching. If you're a teacher, somebody asks a question, you try to answer it. I don't think that gatekeeping in the sense of letting people in was ever an option. It's what I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think also in the world of restaurants and wine, it's also changing quite a bit as well. There are so many great restaurants out there where you see a lot of people starting as bussers or hosts and working their way up to servers and managers. And there is a lot of mentorship and growth that's built in that has become problematic at times, but also can be quite helpful. And it's one of the reasons myself and two other female sommeliers decided to co-found Wine Empowered, which is a 501c3 that offers tuition-free wine education to any women and persons of color in the hospitality industry. just because we realized the biggest barrier to growth and to all of these people becoming sommeliers was simply education. And not education just maybe in the traditional sense. Any of these people are smart enough and creative enough to find the right books and study, but in the sense that there wasn't really a community that welcomed these people in. And so to create a safe space for them all to gather and exchange ideas and take these wine classes together, and they can smell this wine and say what they think and not worry about being belittled or sexualized.
Yeah, I mean, having a voice at all, like having any kind of platform, having any kind of audience is an incredible privilege. And it comes with a responsibility to kind of share that in some way with other people, and especially people who you perceive to be in your, community. Writing about queer food, being sort of ID'd as a voice of queer food sort of earlier, there's this incredibly rich world of queer people, queer expression, queer experience that I can't even, imagine being able to speak to. So, being able to champion other people who are in the space, people of other generations, who look at gender in ways that challenge me. All of those things it's really important to help give those people voice, to let those voices rise if you have a chance to. So it feels like a big responsibility, sometimes, and one that I don't know that I'm up to the challenge of.
I mean, honestly, food media often makes this really difficult. So many publications have one Black writer they go to, one brown writer they go to write about brown food. They sort of help to create this crab in the bucket mentality where like there can only be a select few or one member of this community represented. And it creates a strange sense of like sort of competition among, I feel like, these marginalized communities when like, no, there is space for all of us. It's just like the institutions have sort of created this idea that like whiteness and like sort of straightness and maleness is at the center and everything is outside of that. And they're all like niches. They can't like be mainstream on their own. So Dr. Harris brought up something really interesting, which is like, how do you define success? And I had written a question that was like, when did you feel like you finally kind of broke through a barrier and like found success? And I feel like that's a question about success. And so I'm curious, like, what was that point for all of you? When did you feel like you had really like gotten somewhere meaningful?
I guess the corollary to that would be, or have you?
Yeah, no, that's a great corollary. Or have you not gotten there yet? Dr. Harris, you said you don't feel successful, which feels, I don't know, that I
don't feel unsuccessful, but I mean, I'm just not sure what the determinants of success are. Obviously, here's one for you. I just got the James Beard Lifetime Achievement Award.
Yep.
In a year that restaurants and their survival is seriously in question, in a year that people of color are having unspeakable difficulties, particularly Black Americans. It's like what's going on is a level of insanity that I'm not sure I'm glad to have lived long enough to see. I think that once you think about that, then determinants for success are very, very, very hard to establish, very hard to articulate in a way. I think that getting the beard this year perhaps as opposed to last year or 2 years ago or at another point in time. I don't know. I don't know if it would have made me feel more successful to walk on a stage in Chicago. I don't know if it would have made me feel exactly the same. I don't know, what does success mean? Does it mean getting published? I certainly felt successful when I did that. It's been a while, and I haven't necessarily managed to maintain that, sort of feeling of success. I think there's an inherent self-satisfaction in the sense of feeling successful that I have never felt. I'm not satisfied. I mean, I'm kind of, I can't say annoyed, but bemused with the Lifetime Achievement Award, because I think I got a whole lot more stuff I want to do. So, that's not the end of the Lifetime Achievement Award. I mean, I got my first one from the Southern Foodways Alliance when I was in my 50s. It was annoying at that point. I think there are all sorts of things that we don't necessarily factor in. I'm curious to hear what Victoria and John have to say, and you as well, Priya.
I think, I'm still quite young and have a lot to learn, and I hope a lot to achieve. So I don't know if I'm quite at that level of success yet. I can only hope to achieve as much as Dr. Harris has in my lifetime. But for me, I think when I felt some sort of level of success was when I finally had the ability to hold a position of power and be able to mold others and to be able to kind of give back in a way. And I remember at Coat, we were very lucky and we received a Michelin star right away. We got all these amazing reviews. I had my second book deal, but none of that really resonated as much as when we were able to hold our first wine class that was free to anyone who worked there. Dishwashers, food runners, hosts, everyone signed up. And to be in front of those students who were so curious and so driven, but had not before been given the opportunity to learn like this and take a free wine class, that's when I really felt successful. Like I was really making a difference in the world, and maybe that these other people would go out into the world and also make a difference. And for me, that felt like success, I suppose.
Yeah, I think for me, having a voice in some way has felt like success, has felt like privilege. And, I think to get there, I didn't necessarily plan it this way, but to get there, I wrote my biggest pieces, the pieces that I'm proudest of, for publications that weren't very prestigious, that were small, that had pretty small, limited audiences. But I got to have a voice, and I felt like I didn't have to compromise. And so I think, that has felt like a triumph in many ways. Like I was able to express myself. I was able to cultivate a voice and have a voice and feel like I had some kind of audience out there. And that's been the most gratifying part of what I do. Once the James Beard Foundation gives you an award for that, it kind of moves you into a different category. And there's, I think, peril there, because as you write for publications or try to sell books, the consequences get bigger, and it can be harder to preserve that voice. It can be harder to have that voice without pressure to compromise. So I think, not being paid much money, writing for a scrappy publication that feels like it's your community, is huge success in food media.
For me, it was, frankly, the first time I felt successful was when I called my dad to tell him that I was going to publish, that I had sold a book about my mom's recipes. And he told me that he was proud of me. That was the time that I felt first successful in my career. more than anything else that's happened in my life. One thing that's like an interesting through line between all of our answers is that success was not found in awards. Success was not found in writing for big, prestigious food publications. However, in this field, this is how success, I feel like, for a lot of, I feel like there's sort of an undercurrent that is what success means. Like, do you disagree? Do you like, what do you make of that? Like, there are clear benchmarks in this industry for success. Do you feel like those benchmarks are not good ones to have? Like, do you think they should exist? What do you think?
Well, I think the real value of awards is that ideally, and with any luck, you get to extend your voice. You get to project your voice further than you would have been able to, and I mean that's an incredible privilege. So, to me, it's about just being able to tell stories, to go on telling stories to newer audiences, hopefully telling the stories that you really believe in. But I think, any value to, that's really the essential value of awards in this industry is, being able to live to tell your story to an expanded audience.
Yeah, and I think that the definition of success, or these things, these benchmarks constantly change. 15, 20 years ago, or rather 15 years ago, if you said that you wrote for an online magazine, people wouldn't even really care. Now, if I, have a column in a print magazine, no one even knows how they can get it there. There's not, newsstands in New York, there aren't actually newsstands. They just sell cigarettes or jewels these days. So there's nowhere for them to even find them, which I think is very interesting. Or rather, Priya, your YouTube channel was incredibly successful. Versus sometimes, if you're on the morning news, not a lot of people watch that anymore, or what have you. So I think it's constantly changing. And I think that at the end of the day, none of those things really matter. It's more about what it allows you to do and what you do with that platform. So I think that is what success is taking that platform and using it for something that is meaningful and that, allows you to speak your truth.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dr. Harris, do you want to jump in, or do you want me to ask the next question?
I think you can ask the next question, because I certainly agree. I think that there are any number of generational questions. I think some of the responses get us back to the question of gatekeepers in the sense of closed things, as in, who is giving those awards? How is it determined? What are all of those things that are happening? This is one of those things that is can be a sticky wicket. Who says what? Yeah. Who determines that what you do is valid, if you will? Because we're really talking about a certain kind of validation. Right. Who determines that? You know your mother's food. Somebody who doesn't know your mother's food can perhaps say, well, this recipe does this or produces this to me, or this seems to be this, that, or the other, or what. But they are not there in terms of the bedrock. So we've got all sorts of questions like that come up with things as well. When you talk about experiences, we've got the same set of questions that come up. Are we able to say that we can all experience a common sort of humanity that then lets us understand parallels in other people's lives and other people's cultures and other people's ways of being in the world? I'd like to think yes. I'm not sure I always agree that we do, but I'd like to think we are capable of it. But we get into all of those questions when we start talking about these things, and it's sort of an interesting conversation. I think there are also a great number of generational issues that are involved in things that I'm not even going to go into, in terms of how people were taught to measure or to benchmark successes.
Right. So this isn't something that I think about a lot. I'm sure all of you get emails from folks asking for advice on how to break into the industry, sort of how you got your start, what your path was. And I'm not always sure if I can recommend the path that I took. I don't know if like my path would make sense for someone. It wasn't a particularly, at times, not a particularly pleasant path. And I'm curious to hear from you all. Would you recommend the path that you took in your career to someone else from your community?
I don't know. I wrote for free for years. I had a full-time job. I wrote for supermarket, handout things. I wrote for things that were 2 steps up from tabloid rags. And I pretty much wrote everything I could write and then assembled that and took it to a publication and sort of traded publications up. I didn't start out as a food writer. I started out as a writer, journalist. I did theater reviews. I did book reviews. I did articles about art shows. I came out of the Black arts movement in the 70s in New York City. So a lot of those things were part of what was the fodder for my writing. And then when I finally got to Essence, and I was the travel editor of Essence in the 70s, that's where I started writing about food. And then the food writing came along with the travel and culture writing after that. And I don't know that I'd recommend it. I think there are probably better ways, but remember, I am of an age when people weren't getting MFAs in writing.
Yeah.
Didn't exist. The whole career path didn't exist. People are majoring in things nowadays at universities that make my head spin around, in good ways, but they just didn't exist. I think there are so many more ways to get into a field. I mean, from blogging to, podcasting. I mean, the field has expanded.
Yeah.
It was a very narrow and circumscribed field when I started it.
Yeah, I cooked in restaurants for about 17 years before I started writing. So that was probably a bit too long. I'm not sure that I would recommend spending so much time in the first career before kind of jumping into a second career. But, for me, as I was doing that in San Francisco, I wrote about food occasionally in an LGBTQ weekly paper, like a free throwaway paper. There'd be stacks of them at the entrances to gay bars. And so I felt like not that many people were ever reading what I had to say. And that feeling continued even when I started sort of calling myself a writer. And I think that had tremendous value. Kind of looking back at that, it felt like I wasn't self-conscious. I felt like, well, I'm writing this for just a few people within what I perceive to be my community. So no one's going to get that mad at me. if I go out on a limb or try something experimental. So I think kind of writing and trying to get rid of self-consciousness, which, you know, perhaps nowadays is really difficult now that there are just huge platforms that didn't exist in those days. But yeah, writing as if not that many people are reading you to start, I think is great training to you know, develop a voice. So.
Yeah, and for me, you know, I started out so young. I was 13, a diner waitress, you know, trying to support myself because of a difficult childhood, and worked my way up to bartending in college, and then was a cellar hand in a wine cellar, and then worked harvest in California, and then became a sommelier when I was 21. So, you know, being so young in this industry, it certainly opened me up, you know, for a lot of harassment and abuse. It was like I was a lamb being thrown into this den of wolves. And you know, looking back now, it's certainly not something I would recommend to other young women. It was a very difficult path, and one that, like you said, Priya, was certainly not pleasant at times. But that being said, though, you know, I think it's also when you're forging this new path, not to say I was the first woman ever to be, you know, get into wine. There are many other wonderful women that came before me, but I think that you sort of make the path a little bit easier for those behind you. And maybe easy is not the right word, but you make it better, more sustainable. And so I think that now there's so many other great women and persons of color getting into wine that I think they're making this path a lot easier. So, you know, I would recommend starting from the bottom and working your way up. I think one of the biggest problems with young people in wine today, and I'm, you know, speaking for myself as well, is that, you know, you just sort of graduate culinary school, or, you know, you take a wine course, and then all of a sudden you want a 6-figure salary, you want to be called a fancy sommelier. Well, it doesn't work that way. I think the best chefs I know and the best wine people start from the bottom and work their way up. So I think that's the best education there is.
I mean, it's so tough because like even like writing for free, starting from the bottom, like working at small publications, all of that like requires a tremendous amount of privilege to even be able to do that in the first place. Like I think about when I moved to New York, I sold a cookbook about how to take like food in your dining hall and transform it. And my book, I think that deal was $6,000, and I received half of the advance up front. That $3,000 allowed me to pay my first 3 months rent in New York. It allowed me to take a shitty job in like the food and restaurant industry, so that, and like allowed me to like live in New York while I like applied for jobs in food media. And it, like at the end of the day, this is like you have to be able to afford to be a food writer, to be a sommelier, to do all of those things. And I, you know, even as our industry gets more inclusive, I sometimes worry that the voices needed the most, which are honestly like voices of groups who cannot afford to eat at fine dining restaurants or write for free, are often kind of excluded from the narrative. And it makes me feel like I want to feel optimistic, but I often feel sort of pessimistic. And I'm sort of curious, like what you all sort of outlook and prognosis for this industry is, and sort of how you're feeling, especially after this year.
Well, Priya, just to piggyback on what you said, I mean, remember now, I wrote for free, but I wrote for free because I had a job that paid me and allowed me to indulge my, if you will, my love for something else.
Of course.
I think that's a factor that happens to a lot of people. I talk to an increasing number of young writers, particularly young Black women writers, who are like, I have a full-time job, and full-time jobs have become infinitely more flexible than they were. I have a job, but this is what I do, and that's what sustains me. And that whole balance of things is something that I'm finding a lot of people are finding as a way in. Hopefully they won't take as long as I did to be able to maybe sustain themselves. I'm not sure I still can, but I think that that's something to not be ignored.
Sure.
When I got into this industry, I had very little idea that most of the people who were my contemporaries were all married to doctors or rich lawyers, and who were therefore able to support, not able to support their habit, if you will, because they didn't have to pay the mortgage or the rent or the food bill or the whatever. So I think all of those things are things we need to look at. And I don't think we, as an industry, or particularly two young people coming into writing and working, look at in the face. This is not an industry where you start out making money.
Yeah.
It just isn't. It has never been thus. Everybody, I remember eons ago, I addressed a graduating class at the Culinary Institute of America, and I said, congratulations. Everybody sort of sat up. And then I said, you are not chefs. And they all looked most bemused and slightly, horrified. But we have this sort of instant gratification thing about things. These are things that take the proverbial time. And that's not to say go slow. That's not what I'm talking about. But it is to say that we need to be mindful that these things have never really been things that happened unless they were happening because folks had largesse of some sort behind them. I'm not a trust fund kid. I had to work. I think that's the case for a lot of people.
Yeah. I mean, do you feel optimistic for the future? Do you feel like we are creating a future where more Black women can come up and succeed?
I think some of that has already been done. I think that is a case. But quite frankly, and I'm not even going to talk about the future because I'm just trying to get to tomorrow at this point in the world in which we are currently living. I think that there are an awful lot of changes that I'd like to see sustained for a while before I start making, prognostications one way or the other. I want to see, in the immortal words of Napoleon's mom, "Pourvu que ça dure," which means, please God, let it last. I'd like to see some of it last.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's good about right now and what's good about the future is that gatekeepers have less power. The sort of media gatekeepers. I mean, in this past year, we've seen figures topple who I never would have imagined would have fallen. And there's a reassessment in this moment of what food media is, what it should be, its future. Of course, that's a healthy thing. I'm not sure it's going to be sustained. I'd like to see it be sustained. I'd like to see it lead to change. Even if it doesn't, I think a lot of what would have been considered marginal voices have seeped in. They've been able to sort of flow in through the holes that all of this disruption has created. And people, still aren't making money. They weren't making money in my day. They weren't making money in James Beard's day. But those voices are out there. I mean, they've been unleashed, and it's my optimistic hope is that they can't be forgotten now. Those voices are out there in such number that they just can't be ignored if and when this moment passes. So I feel quite happy about the complexity of stories being told right now, a kind of general understanding that real food stories are complex stories, not simple cliches about, community and celebration. So I at least feel optimistic about that, about the volume of stories out there and the quality of them.
Yeah, and I mean, to both Dr. Harris and John's points, I think that real change just comes with time. So, I think we should continue to kind of monitor and empower these voices that are, long overdue on the scene, and, really kind of continue to push those interesting stories and those new narratives. And I think that's what's going to make the food world a better place.
Well, I want to honestly thank all of you for the work that you all have done to make the food world a more inclusive and equitable place. Like I just feel really grateful to have been able to be on this panel with all of you. And honestly, especially you, Dr. Harris, I truly feel like we all stand on the shoulders of giants, and you are it. So yeah.
Am I that old?
I think you just need to accept your icon status, Dr. Harris. You can still keep building on it.
I'm working on it. Maybe I'll get there. But thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for a great discussion. I really hope that these discussions continue. I hope that we can all sort of keep, making the table bigger, extending the ladder, bringing more people up with us. And thank you everyone for tuning in.